But this guy that we have on today is a contributor. He calls in some, but he's out there playing a role, and he's one of those guys who kind of shows up at a Tea Party meeting. The next thing you know, he's in I don't want to say power. There's no power, but you're in leadership with the local Tea Party, and that is Hank Sullivan, who's in studio today. Comes in for his second appearance as a guest host today. Hope you're doing well, Hank.
Well, I feel like I'm shot out of a cannon this morning. Like so many of your other guests, we also have other lives too, and we have businesses to run and things to do, and so. But we are. I tell you what, I think I'll speak for all your co-hosts and say how much we appreciate WDUN and how much we appreciate the opportunity to come on and kind of tell people what we think and what we know.
Well, it's what the show's about, and I guess I am bragging about the show. I'm very blessed to be part of it, but for a long time, before me and after me and before others and after others, the show has just continued to run along as a community program where people can do that. Honestly, this show was here before talk radio was ever talk radio in a lot of ways, so you and I are both pretty excited about being here today. But boy, you were a little bummed when you heard the numbers come in. I don't think you're surprised, though, by the numbers, because in that first quarter, we had we had a backtrack, didn't we? We just kind of went backwards as far as numbers are concerned. You want to hit that first this morning?
Yeah, I heard it as I was coming in this morning, that the economy shrank by 3%. Was that on an annual rate in the first quarter or what? But it is shrinking. That's the point. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. The reason why that's happening, and I'm going to propose to you that it's happening because of a removal of liquidity from the economy as a whole. It's not a matter of whether there's demand in the economy. It's that the economy is being stifled. It's like you take oxygen away from the fire, then the fire is going to go out. In our monetary system, the oxygen for growth is being removed. Now, whether they're removing it on purpose, you'd have to determine yourself. But I'm just going to give you the facts today on what's going on with it.
All right, and then we're going to have a conversation on this, folks, that we want you to participate in. It's going to center around the central figure will be the Federal Reserve here. And Hank was on last month, and we kind of got into this, but way too much information. Hank's already told me that. I said there's too much information for the full hour. But we want you to participate, and we'll take it wherever it goes. And then Hank can get with you. You can look through the local Lanier Tea Party Patriots to find him and find out more information.
A lot of information we put online about it.
But what you just said, Hank, takes us back here a little bit. And that's a great analogy and an example of using oxygen in a fire. And so, but it's not just one thing, is it? We might want to pinpoint, well, it would be this program or this tax increase or this administration or this board of commissioners. You name it. They're all parts of it, but there are many working parts in this scenario you have for us.
Yeah, it has to do with the way that money is created in the first place. You see, our monetary system is a debt-based monetary system. All money in the economy is loaned into existence at interest. And so if you don't realize that and you just think that there's money out there and then you need to get your share and then you're going to go to work for this amount of money and you're going to make the best deal you can and all that, that's fine. But the fact of the matter is that a private institution loans us our money at interest. And I've got like 5 things that I wrote down. If it's okay, I want to go through them at the very beginning because I want to make sure that I drill these points home before we get into any kind of nuts and bolts of this. But and anyone who wants to check what I have to say about the way that money is created, I'm going to give you a reference. It's put out by the Chicago Fed. It's called Modern Money Mechanics. Write that down. You can download it and read it yourself. And so a lot of the information I have about the way that money is created is drawn directly from that source, which is probably the best thing that you can see on the way that the Fed operates. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that over the last 5 years, and really before that, but it's been speeding up, actions of the Federal Reserve have resulted in a 2-tier American economy. And I will ask anyone, maybe everybody, if you're sitting at your computer, just grab a pencil and just write these things down so that you can refer to them later on. Go to President Obama's State of the Union address and take a look at the first 5 minutes. He's going to describe to you this 2-tier economy that has resulted from the actions of the Federal Reserve. Now, he doesn't say it's actions of the Federal Reserve. He tells us this is normal, that this is just marketplace factors that are normal, everyday free market capitalism is going to result in this. No, it's not. This is something that is completely different.
So refresh our memory from that, or things that the president talks about. What are some of the things that he talks about that would refresh our memory on what that two-tier...
If you refer to that and just listen to the first 5 minutes, he's going to tell you how stock prices have rarely been higher.
Right, okay.
Those are his words. And he's going to tell you that it just hasn't gotten back down to the middle class. I believe he's really trying to bait the middle class to believe that, okay, he's taking care of the stock market now, so we're next. I don't believe that's the case at all. Because over the last 5 years, you've seen the stock market increasing on an average of 20% per year. 20% per year for 5 years. Now, what has the American economy done? What has the world economy done? It's been dead flat. So something's going on here because the fundamentals are not supporting the stock market appreciation for the last 5 years.
Now, prior to the recession, though, and we did have appreciation for the stock market, did we not? Or did it lead to what we got into? I mean, walk me through that a little bit.
We were in a bubble.
Okay. But people are concerned that we are approaching bubble status again, if not already there, and that the bubble may not be, in other words, a weaker bubble than before. What do you think?
I've got two terms to describe what's going on here. One is bubblenomics, because that's exactly what's going on. They're feeding the stock market with money printed out of the air. But it's also trickle-up poverty. You see, because...
Whoa, wow, what a term.
Yeah, that's
frightening to hear.
Poverty. Because take a look at what's happened to Walmart earnings. They're hitting it at historic lows. Well, you know, the people that are in the lower economic conditions there, a lot of them shop at Walmart. And I shop at Walmart. But Walmart really caters to the folks who don't make as much. Well, they're making so much less right now that they're not even shopping at Walmart. So something's going on there, and that's just a symptom of a larger picture here. But what I'm going to blame on this is mechanisms that the Fed has been involved with. You know, for the last 5 years, we've been in quantitative easing. And I'm going to explain to you exactly what quantitative easing is so that anyone can understand it. They are taking the money supply and they are expanding it and taking that new money that's printed directly out of the air and they're handing it to the banks on Wall Street. Now, if you remember, right after 9/11, President Bush expanded the money supply, but he expanded it and gave all households who paid taxes a check. I think we got a check for $1,600. So when we had a liquidity problem in the economy, they spread the wealth. It really wasn't wealth because it just devalued the currency in everyone's hands, but at least it got money in people's hands so that they would be able to then go out and spend it. Ultimately, the value of the currency goes down whenever you inflate it and there's no economic growth to justify it. But at least he did that. But what's going on for the last 5 years is that they're expanding the money supply and they're concentrating that new amount in the hands of private banks. And these are the private banks who happen to own the Federal Reserve System. So you see what's going on here? When the money is concentrated in the hands of the banks on Wall Street, and then for the past 5 years you see that Wall Street's been going up for 20% per year, but Main Street had been flat, then you can see that what we're having here is a wealth transfer from the people through devaluation of the currency to the banks who are receiving direct payments of money printed out of thin air. I've got a graph here that I want to show you, Joel. You can verify that what I'm telling you here. This is the S&P index, and each one of these colored areas is where quantitative easing is either started or stopped over the past 5 years. And you'll notice that every time they stop quantitative easing, the S&P index starts back down again. And each time they start it back up or announce that they're going to start it back up, the S&P index keeps going up. So obviously something that the Federal Reserve is doing in this quantitative easing mechanism is causing the stock market to rise. I'm also going to show you another graph that shows the S&P index on the same graph as the Federal Reserve balance sheet. When they say the Federal Reserve balance sheet, that's really just telling you how much money the Federal Reserve has pumped into the economy. So look at these two lines, the blue line and the red line. They're parallel. And what that's telling you is that as the Federal Reserve is expanding its balance sheet and making these direct payments to the banks on Wall Street, the S&P index is going up and up and up, while personal income down at the bottom is what?
Going down. Well, it's actually down or flat, according to which one I'm looking at.
Absolutely. So there's no fundamentals supporting the stock prices up there. It's purely money printing. And there is an economic, I guess you call it a benefit to certain people. If you're invested in the stock market, you're probably doing really well. If you're heavily invested, you're doing very well.
Can I ask you a real quick question?
Sure.
Because I'm kind of a student here today trying to learn things, and I don't want to take you from where direction you're going. But we brought up the stock market 4 or 5 times now here in the first segment, and I'm going to ask this question. We'll take a break and come back and let you answer it. But the stock market and the bubble that you mentioned earlier, is the stock market a true indicator of the economy overall? And I think you've really already answered that today. And what will it take to make the stock market rather strong, to see and be reflective of what the economy is? So a couple questions there when we come back, because some people do rather well in recessionary periods because of the stock market. And there's nothing wrong with that.
There are people doing very well right now.
Yeah.
It's just not the middle class.
The
middle class is paying for it.
And it doesn't mean the economy's strong. So that's, I guess what I'm getting to, is that always a good economic indicator? We'll be back in a few moments. Hank Sullivan's our guest today. 9:20 as we continue here on WDUN. Hank Sullivan, he's president of the Lanier Tea Party Patriots, as our guest. How did your meeting go last Thursday night?
It went very well. We had, I don't know how many new people we had show up there.
Good.
It was pretty well packed. Very few seats left in the Gainesville Civic Center, which is where we meet every third Thursday of every month. And we try to have really good, interesting programs for people and pack a lot of punch in them.
Our question going into the break, is the stock market a reliable economic indicator for our country? And you brought up the point, across the board.
The stock market, if it were a free market, would be a pretty good indicator, I think, because it's dependent upon the fundamentals of the economy, whether the stock market's going to do well or not, if it were a free market.
But people are going to go, well, wait a minute, this is the United States of America. This is a free market.
No, we have no free market here. And that's really kind of one of the first things that got me into the Tea Party was that, the Tea Party is built on a tripod of items to promote free markets, to limit the size of government, and one is fiscal responsibility. In my first Tea Party meeting, I went into it and I was listening to them promoting these things. I finally just had to stand up. I said, look, you can't have any of those unless we own our own money. As long as a private bank is controlling the issuance of the currency and charging you interest, and you have to compete with that bank and all of the corporations that bank supports, then you can't have a free market. So these 3 items that the Tea Party nationally promote, free markets, limiting the size of government, and fiscal responsibility, are all agenda items that go right through the front door of the Federal Reserve. You can't be fiscally responsible if you have to borrow to pay your bills. Our government has to borrow to pay its bills. It doesn't have to be that way. But it's been that way for 100 years, and people have lost track of the fact that government should be sovereign. The government should issue the currency, not a private bank, and have to borrow the money from a private bank. It's almost silly when you think about it, but yet we all just run with it. I was 56 years old before I figured this out. Because we're just living our own lives.
It's kind of funny. I thought you were 56 now. You are. We're talking about health off here. You are a pretty healthy guy. Our country actually in the Revolutionary War began printing the Continentals. I think you talked about that last time you were here, or you and I talked about that. We started out with some inflation there and had to get control of it. I guess what I'm getting to in this point, Hank, is that we don't do a very good job in our country learning by history. Maybe we're not taught history the way we're supposed to, but we don't do a very good job learning from history, do we?
No, we do not. You have to go back to the Founding Fathers to really find out what our country's all about, which is one of the things I've done. And that's one of the talks that I give. Give talks on not only the Federal Reserve, but also the meaning of our country. But to understand either one of them, you got to go back to the founding documents and see what our founders said about having a private central bank. In fact, I've got a few quotations here.
Hold that thought. Let's bring Robert on, and then we'll get to those, because I would love to hear those. I would, and we'll get a little history lesson at the same time. Robert, hi, welcome to WDUN.
In America right now, corporations are cutting expenses, they're firing people, they're limiting pensions, they're doing all they can to cut expenses and people out. The problem is the people they fired, even though the stock is going through the roof, they don't have the same income or any income. In America, what's going to happen, these corporations that are making money by cutting expenses, no one's going to have money to buy their goods or services. That's what's going to hit the fan.
They're killing the goose that laid the golden egg. That's essentially what's going on.
It's one thing to have a great stock price, but you still need a market for your goods and services.
Absolutely. Another thing that's contributing to that, and beyond just the manipulation of the Federal Reserve banks, is stock buyback programs. Corporations are buying back their stock because money is so cheap. They're borrowing the money at 0%, and they're buying back their own stock, which is appreciating their stock prices, which just adds into the whole thing. So it's just nothing but manipulation going on.
But you still, as you say, the whole thing about killing the goose that laid the golden egg, at some point, you're going to have a market of people who have some money to spend, and it ain't there, buddy.
And to quote Hank's term, trickle-up poverty is not the way to get it done.
No, it can't be supported that way, because trickle-up poverty is a program that eventually gets to everyone. It's just a matter that it starts at the very bottom with the folks who have the least in reserve, and they're the ones that go on government dependence the earliest. But eventually it goes to everyone if the mechanisms that are causing it do not change.
Welcome back as we continue our morning talk. 770-535-2911 and 800-552-WDUN. Federal Reserve System born in 1913, correct, Hank?
That's correct.
By the way, Hank Sullivan, so I'm just acting like we're just going on here. Hank, let's lean in that mic just a little bit more there. Okay. There you go. I want to make sure people hear you loud and clear.
Sure.
But 1913... the more I study about the Woodrow Wilson administration, the more I don't like the Woodrow Wilson administration on several fronts, and this is one of those. And we're dealing with that today because you mentioned off here what happens later on to World War I,
1913, the Federal Reserve comes in. 1914, World War I starts.
And you made a statement off here that these people like war sometimes because there's money to be made in war. Explain.
Absolutely. The military-industrial complex doesn't make any money unless there's wars. And so as soon as bombs are dropped, they got to be replaced. Well, bombs are very expensive items. So somebody's making that, so they want to make more of them. So any way that they can involve themselves in the political process to encourage war, they're going to do that.
Let me jump forward about 25 years because I hear people that were born around recessionary times or depression times or World War II, and they will say, well, hey, World War II got us out of the depression. Was FDR thinking about that by not entering the war and becoming the supplier of products to the Allies, in other words? Did he have a twofold mission there?
You know, there's a lot that is said about Franklin Roosevelt, whether he even knew that Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked, and because he had the aircraft carriers were out of Pearl Harbor when the attack happened, all that. I think it's all plausible, but I don't know that it's really useful necessarily to venture into at this point.
What we do know, though, is that the war in Europe was raging and going, and he said, hey, we're not going. And it's similar to today. We're a war-weary nation out of World War I. We've come out of the recession or depression in these situations. But then we did get pulled into the war.
Something needed to awake the sleeping giant.
All right, so then with the Federal Reserve here, we were talking a little bit about those situations and the crash. At 29, you get the crash, and then you're going through the depression, and you were talking off air that some people made well. I mean, people were brought up on the program that goes to Jekyll Island, and the Vanderbilts and the DuPonts and all these other people who did very well. People can do well in recession and depressionary times, but who gets affected most, and who's the first person to get affected?
The first person to get affected is the guy who owes money, and the first guy who is affected positively is the guy to whom the money is owed.
Okay.
And as long as he has property securing the loan, then he can go after the property. And so in 1929, I've heard this many, many times, that so many dollars of wealth were destroyed. No, it wasn't. It just changed hands. It changed hands from the person who had borrowed money to own the property, and the property reverted to the person who had loaned the money. And the deal is that there's been court cases on this where people have sued and said that the banks are not at risk with their money. Certain banks are not at risk. Their local banks are at risk, but the Federal Reserve is not at risk because it simply prints money out of thin air. And the banks on Wall Street, they're not at risk because they own the Federal Reserve, and so the money that comes to them is essentially printed out of thin air as well. The way that money is created is through a debt accrual. In other words, the bank will loan money to an individual. That's the way your credit card works. The money didn't exist until you charged something on your credit card, and the money was magically created out of the air, but you have to pay it back sometimes at 20-some-odd% interest. But the bank who issues it is really not at risk because they didn't have to borrow it themselves necessarily. Now, some banks do, but where the money actually comes from, the banks are really not at risk. One of the things I'll say on that regard is that one of the guys that really clued me into all of this was Andrew Jackson. He
fought them, did he not?
He did. He had a decades-long battle with the same people that we're battling against today. Not the same individuals, they're all dead, but same institutions. And one of his quotes, and I think I can get it verbatim, and this is what he wrote to the bankers. "I've been watching you for a long time. You speculate in the breadstuffs of our country. In other words, you're buying commodities. You're buying bets in the future prices of things. When you win, you divide the profits amongst you. And when you lose, you charge your losses to the bank. In other words, they're not at risk. When they lose, they simply get reimbursed their ante from the central bank." That's exactly what's been going on. That's exactly what quantitative easing is. That's exactly what TARP has been. And so essentially the banks are just not at risk.
All right, hold on, because we've got a lot of stuff here I want to kind of dive into with this. But under Andrew Jackson, it actually closed down that first attempt at a federal bank, correct?
It was the second attempt, and it came about as a result of the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was essentially a war about banking. The British said either you're going to install the Bank of England as your bank, and the money will be issued at interest to the people, or we're going to war. And so we went to war. Well, if you look back at the Treaty of Paris, I think it's in 1816, you will find that part of the provisions of that treaty were that we would adopt the bank for 20 years. It had a 20-year sunset on it, and it turned out that Andrew Jackson, he was the president when it came up to sign. The Congress passed it, but he would not sign the legislation, and they could not override his veto, and so the bank was killed. And that's what I think it's on his tombstone. He said, wow. I killed the bank.
As 1836 had expired.
I think it was 1836.
Okay. So we go 1836 to about 1865 with kind of a free banking system.
Yes and no. It's just they didn't have the full franchise to issue the currency, but there were still Bank of England banks.
Okay, all right. But the build-up here in this country continued to kind of simmer and try to build back. I'm taking as to where we're led to today. Because you mentioned, as we were talking off here, that the people that get hurt in depression or recessionary times are never the big guys. Yeah. The people that jump out of the windows, as you look back in the Great Depression, middle management. Yeah. Other words, middle-class Americans that get hurt. And I said, it's kind of like Wonderful Life with Potter and against George Bailey. And you say that when you watch that, it's exactly what we're talking about.
That's exactly right. He was buying the shares of the building loan for 10 cents on the dollar. So he was taking advantage of everyone else who was panicking when there was a run on the bank. And that's exactly what does go on.
Hank Sullivan, our guest here today on WDUN, president of the Lanier Tea Party Patriots. We're talking about the Federal Reserve. So then, when we get to panicky times, 2008, what did we do? What do we do as Americans? And we repeat this process, don't we?
The property reverted to the banks. And to the extent that the banks themselves were at risk, then a lot of that property got swallowed up when those banks got swallowed up. So what you had in there was a consolidation of our banking industry, which works to the advantage of the major banks and works to the disadvantage of the smaller banks.
How big a role? Because just a few moments ago, you thought that our bankings, what was the term you used? You thought it ended in 2008. In other words,
yeah. See, I believe every mechanism that's been set up in place by the Federal Reserve supports the notion that the Federal Reserve monetary system actually died in 2008. I say that because we've had 0% interest rates for 5 years. And in Europe, they're going negative interest rates. They're sucking the lifeblood out of our economy to keep these banks going. And that supports the notion that the reason that they're having to do that is because they're not going to be able to exist unless they can suck the wealth out of our economy.
Ben Bernanke, during that time, chairman of the Federal Reserve, big student of the Depression.
Absolutely.
What role did that play in what he did or didn't do, or had the Federal Reserve play? And I think I know the answer to this, but tell us what that is.
Well, that's a great question, because he is widely regarded as the world's foremost authority on the Great Depression and expert on it. And you just think about it. If Ben Bernanke wanted to cause a depression, he could do it.
Well, but
he would know exactly what to do.
Because we see just little glimpses of that when the Federal Reserve chair comes out and speaks, and we can see what the stock market does or other indicators do, whether it's a negative or positive, or they make one misstep.
Yeah.
Yellen makes one misstep in one of the first things she says, and things get a little shaky. Remember that in a couple of days?
The reason why that is because there's no transparency. Nobody knows what's going on behind the doors at the Federal Reserve. They come out and tell you what they're doing, but are they really doing that? They're saying that they are tapering this quantitative easing. I don't see any evidence that they're tapering quantitative easing, because if they did, then the U.S. Treasuries would be going up. There would be
That's a good economic indicator.
A decline in the demand for U.S. Treasuries because the Federal Reserve has been buying those. Well, if it was tapering their buying, then the price of U.S. Treasuries would be going down, which means the yield would be going up. They don't want the yield to go up.
Okay. So without the transparency, you take 10 Americans, how many people know what's going on in the Federal? How many people understand the Federal Reserve, do you think? 9 out of the 10, 8 out of the 10, 9.5 don't know? I mean, what do you think it is that we as Americans, how disengaged or uninformed are we?
I think everybody in your listening audience now is in the 99th percentile of anyone who knows anything about the Federal Reserve just from listening to what we're saying this morning.
How about that? That's pretty interesting. It's also a telltale sign for us, because the point being, a lot of times we panic.
Yeah.
And we immediately look to Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Maybe the last place we need to look, because there are things that we can do to have a strong economy that doesn't depend on the federal government.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that we can do is reclaim the ownership of our currency. That is the answer. The American people need to own their currency. Think of it as infrastructure, like roads and bridges. We own the roads and bridges, and we can use them. Well, the way that our founders designed our system was that the U.S. Treasury would loan the money into existence to the people. But it's really because the people own the money and own the U.S. Treasury, they're just loaning it to themselves.
So it's a simple, fair process.
Absolutely.
It's like your own savings account in your family, and I'm going to borrow out of my savings account to put a new roof on. But I'm going to put money back into that savings account for the next time.
Life insurance policy.
Okay, there you go.
You borrow from your life insurance policy, you're just borrowing from yourself. The same thing. And that is the way that the law of Moses was set up, that did not allow for the borrowing of money at interest. Well, see, if you're paying interest to yourself, you're not paying any interest. And that's the way the founders set up our system.
Yeah, but people that finance their own business, people that finance their own cars, I mean, people do it. There are people that do it all the time.
Absolutely.
Those are the solid folks that, yeah. All right, hey, Bob. Bob in Gainesville's here. Hi, Bob. You're on WDUN. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, gentlemen. Robert, caller in the first half hour, had made the observation that when large corporations eliminate workers to increase their profits, they're decreasing their potential customer base for their products and services. And I'd say that our federal government is facilitating this transition, and it's intentional. What's happening more and more is the government is becoming the customer, and it distributes those products and services to the citizens for free or some subsidized amount. So the federal government is prodding the citizenry into this state of dependency. I believe that is quite intentional. And, one of the large scandals we're talking about now for the last few weeks is the IRS, attacking the Tea Parties, not allowing them to get established or tax-exempt status. And I think the Tea Party represents an opposing view to this. And beyond just representing those of us who value liberty, the Tea Party is also educating the general populace about the dangers of, and I hate to use the word, because a lot of people just write me off immediately, but the dangers of communism. I know I could say socialism or, Piven and Cloward and all these, but what we're moving to is pure old communism. That's when the government supplies everything and we are all dependent.
Can I give you an alternate viewpoint on that?
Sure.
Rather than communism itself, I think what I see is more of a corporate fascism. The top layer is corporate fascism, where corporations have bought so much interest in the government, and each one of those corporations their goal is to become a monopoly. And so if they can buy enough interest in the government, then the government will make decisions in their favor. And then ultimately, this corporate fascist partnership between corporations and corporatism and government ends up looking like a communist state. But at the very top of it is a corporate structure. The reason why I say that I believe that's the case more than just direct communism is because communism doesn't have a means of support. Nobody is going to volunteer to build a prison that they're going to be held in. And communism is really kind of a structure. It's kind of it's the systems that are in place to control the people, but all that's got to be paid for, and it's got to be paid for out of a corporate profit scenario. So yes, communism is one of the results, but the funding mechanism is a corporate fascism, I believe.
Bob, good question. Hank, good talk back and forth with you guys. Bob, great having you on the program of the day. Thank you for being here this morning. We've got to take a break, though. It's 9:51. We'll be right back as we continue on WDUN. 9:54. Hank was laughing off here. He said he's got his laptop open over here, and he's got many talking points. Because I've gotten to 3 so far. I mean, because this is too big to wrap your arms around in 1 or 2 shows. This is the second show, actually. So we're about 2 hours into it. So school will continue. Hank's going to come back and be with us. Hey, Bob had a nice call there a few moments ago, and we talk about growth. Look at what I was thinking about is look what communities do to attract a government project, a government base, a government office. I mean, we do that all the time. Communities love to do that because that's money coming in that kind of works around the economy sometimes. In other words, like you're talking about, money's printed, so it's funded. It's not like when you attract a fledgling business or a business and the economy works on that. And the same thing I would think when we go and, hey, we got a federal grant to help with our state education or help to build a road or a park. And that's kind of the same thing. If you can't pay for it yourself, then you don't need to be doing it.
Absolutely. My business is here, but I live in Forsyth County, and I had an objection with them taking several $1,000s to build a sidewalk to connect 2 communities. They received a grant from the federal government to do this, and it was only going to help those 2 communities to the extent that building a sidewalk is going to help people. I thought, well, now, why don't the people just ante up if they want a sidewalk? But why does every American in the world have to go into debt to build this sidewalk over here?
If people in Cheyenne, Wyoming want a sidewalk, people in Cheyenne can build it. If people in Cumming want a sidewalk, people in Cumming can build it.
Absolutely.
And surely there's enough money in Cumming to build a sidewalk without having to go, because that only adds to the $17 trillion debt we have.
Yeah, that's the point. It's the principle of the thing, that everybody who wants to take free money from the federal government, but it's not free. So that's why, to borrow it.
Right, and that's why, just when you talk about tax increases and wanting to get level, I don't care what size government is, whether it's the one proposed in Hall County now or not, to get government back to a level. We don't need government at those levels. We need to actually be shrinking all governments, for the most part, to run within our means. Because, again, if Hall County can't run within its means right now, why do they need a tax increase?
Yeah, government at local level and state level is different than government at the federal level.
I understand, but the principle's the same.
Well, it is and it isn't. See, we do have to have a fiscal responsibility that's based upon a certain number of dollars coming in and a certain number of dollars going out. But at the federal level, it's different because every dollar that comes into existence actually funds our economy at the federal level. So it's a different mechanism.
No, you're okay. You're right. You're absolutely right. Not that I was disagreeing with you, but that tying back into the whole thing we're talking about here today, that's very, very true. Really quick, I'd be remiss as a president of a local Tea Party organization just to ask you your thoughts on Thad Cochran and the Tea Party candidate in Mississippi last night, who is Chris McDaniel. Boy, he ran strong, but I
think it's a testimony to maybe a flaw in the electoral process, allowing Democrats to vote in Republican primaries and vice versa. I mean, if you're going to polarize the electorate in the first place and have 2 different political parties, then only the people that are registered Republicans ought to be able to vote Republican and Democrats, because then they're all going to try to influence each other's election to get the weaker candidate.
I'm afraid that there'll be some payoff to some unions in Mississippi on the Republican side. And really, if you can't stand on what you really are, and I don't know if Thad Cochran's a conservative or not. I think he's a guy who's taking a lot of money from Washington into his state, so maybe he is what he is. Hank, thank you very much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to doing it again.